Under the dying light of the desert sun, the wind carried the smell of dust, sweat, and horses. The land stretched endless and red, as if it had bled for centuries beneath the boots of men who believed they could own it. A wagon creaked along a trail that cut through the barren wild, guarded by rough-faced traders. Inside it sat a young woman, her wrists tied, her face streaked with dirt and fear. Her eyes, though hollow from exhaustion, still burned with a defiance that unsettled the men who had captured her. They didn't know her name, only that she was valuable, more valuable than gold, in a world where beauty could be traded like cattle. She had been taken from a burned settlement near the southern border, where smoke still rose from what had once been her home. The traders spoke in low voices, planning to sell her at the next outpost where soldiers and settlers gathered, a place where flesh and coin were often exchanged under the banner of law. She sat quietly, her mind chasing fragments of memory, her father's weathered hands, her mother's lullabies, the distant sound of a river that once lulled her to sleep. But those memories felt like whispers from another life. As the wagon rolled into the heart of Apache territory, the air changed. The silence grew heavier, and even the horses seemed to sense it. One of the men spat over the side and said the tribe's name under his breath, as if saying it too loud might summon spirits from the cliffs. They all knew stories of what happened to those who trespassed too far. Still, greed drove them forward. The next morning, as the sun burned through the mist, a dark figure appeared on the ridge alone, Apache rider, tall and still, watching them from a distance. The traders panicked, urging the horses to move faster. But dust rose behind them, and soon shadows began to appear across the horizon. Dozens of riders' faces painted, bows drawn, descended like ghosts of the desert. The traders tried to fire their rifles, but their bullets vanished into the wind. Within moments, the ground trembled beneath the hooves of the Apache horses. The wagon was surrounded. When the dust settled, the traders lay disarmed and trembling. The young woman remained in the wagon, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. She expected to be taken next, sold again, or worse. But as one of the Apache riders pulled back the canvas and looked inside, he froze, his eyes sharp and ancient. Locked on the mark that lay hidden beneath the dirt on her shoulder, a faded tattoo, small but unlike anything he had seen. It was the symbol of a tribe long thought to be extinct, one that had vanished generations ago after being betrayed by settlers and soldiers alike. The man turned and shouted in Apache, his tone commanding. The other stepped back as he dismounted. He was not like the rest, his presence commanded silence, his every movement deliberate. His long black hair fell in braids, bound with leather cords, and his eyes carried both wisdom and warning. The woman stared at him, uncertain whether he was her savior or her captor. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. Without a word, he reached out and brushed away the dirt from her shoulder, revealing the full tattoo. A sharp breath escaped him, and his expression changed from warrior to something deeper, almost reverent. The traders tried to speak, to explain, but his gaze silenced them. He turned to his men and spoke with quiet authority, and instantly the air shifted. The traders were dragged away toward the canyon, the protests echoing uselessly against the rock walls. The woman was lifted from the wagon, her bindings cut. She stumbled to her feet, weak and unsteady. The Apache leader looked at her again, studying every feature as if trying to read the story written on her skin. He spoke in a low voice, his English rough but clear. "This mark," he said, pointing to her shoulder, "belongs to my blood." She shook her head, not understanding. He stepped closer. "You will come with me," he said firmly. "You will not be sold." The men around him looked at each other, whispering. Some appeared uneasy. She couldn't understand their language, but she could feel the tension. The leader's decision had waited defied their custom. Captives were either traded, ransomed, or left behind. But his gaze did not waver. He turned to his second-in-command and said in Apache, "She is under my protection. The desert has returned her to me." That night, as the campfires burned against the wind, the young woman sat apart, wrapped in a blanket of woven wool. The Apache camp was alive with quiet movement, men sharpening blades, women tending to food, children watching her from a distance with wide, curious eyes. The leader sat by the fire across from her, silent, his expression unreadable. She wanted to ask where they were taking her, but every time she tried to speak, his eyes stopped her. There was something in them, something that saw through her fear. The old healer of the tribe came forward. What? Her face lined like the desert cliffs. She took the woman's hand, turned it palm up, and whispered something in Apache. Then she looked toward the leader and nodded slowly. The warrior's jaw tightened, and he rose. He walked toward the captive woman, his footsteps measured, and when he spoke again, his words were heavy with meaning. "You were meant to die with your people," he said quietly. "But the spirits kept you alive. The mark on your skin tells me why." The wind stirred between them, carrying embers into the night. He looked at her as if seeing someone from another time, someone whose fate was bound to his long before either of them were born. The tribe fell silent, watching as he extended his hand. She hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his palm. His grip was firm, but not cruel. "You belong to the old blood," he said, his voice low, his words trembling with something between power and sorrow. "And by the law of the ancestors, you will be my wife." No. The fire crackled, and murmurs swept through the camp. Some of the men looked stunned, others fearful. The young woman's breath caught in her throat. She tried to pull away, but his hand tightened just enough to remind her that this was not a request. It was a declaration sealed by something older than both of them. Above them, the desert moon rose, painting the land in silver light. She looked at the Apache king and saw no cruelty in his face, only certainty, the kind that came from destiny written in the bones of the earth. Yet her heart pounded with confusion, fear, and something else she could not name. Far away, the last embers of her old life faded into the night wind. Ahead of her stretched a path she could neither choose nor escape. And as the firelight flickered in his dark eyes, she realized the story was only beginning, one that would test the boundaries of freedom, love, and fate itself. The night after the Apache king's declaration stretched long and restless. The young woman sat near the fire, her eyes wide open though exhaustion pressed against her bones. Every sound around her, the distant call of an owl, the murmur of guards speaking in Apache, the hiss of burning wood, reminded her that she was no longer among her own people. The stars above the desert sky glowed fierce and endless, but she felt caged beneath them. The words he had spoken, "You will be my wife," kept replaying in her head. They echoed with a weight she could not understand. She didn't know his name, yet his voice lingered like a promise she couldn't escape. By dawn, the camp began to move. The Apache women gathered blankets and pottery. The warriors prepared their horses, and the children whispered as they glanced her way. The king, now dressed in his war leathers, looked like part of the desert itself, strong, silent, carved by the wind. He ordered the men to ride east toward the mountains, and she was placed upon a small mare that followed behind him. 2 riders flanked her sides, not cruel but cautious, as if guarding something sacred rather than dangerous. She didn't know what fate awaited her in the Apache lands, only that escape was no longer possible. The journey carried them across dry plains, in canyons where hawks circled in the high air. The heat pressed heavy, and the wind stung her face with sand. Yet despite her fear, something about the rhythm of the land began to touch her, its quiet strength, its vastness, its silence that spoke louder than any human tongue. She watched the Apache riders move in harmony with the earth, their horses guided not by reins, but by instinct. It was a life she didn't understand, but it stirred something deep in her, something she had forgotten existed. As they reached the shadow of the mountains, the riders slowed. The king dismounted and motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, her legs weak, but he waited patiently. When she stepped down, his hand brushed hers briefly, steadying her. And for a moment she saw something in his eyes, a trace of gentleness, hidden beneath the layers of command. He led her toward a spring that bubbled from between rocks, and she knelt beside it, cupping the cold water in her trembling hands. The reflection in the pool startled her. Dirt streaked her face, her hair tangled and sunburned, yet her eyes held the same defiance as before. The Apache king crouched beside her and spoke softly. "This mark," he said, touching the place on her shoulder where the tattoo lay, It belonged to a woman from my bloodline. Long ago, before my people were hunted, there was a family that carried this sign. Only one survived after the war with the soldiers. That was my grandmother." His gaze drifted toward the horizon. "She said that one day the blood would return through the desert. Now you stand before me, and the spirits do not lie." She wanted to speak, to tell him she knew nothing of this legacy, but her throat tightened. The truth was, she didn't know where the tattoo came from. It had been there since before she could remember, a faded mark her mother once called a curse. Her mother had always refused to explain it. Now, miles away from everything she knew, the mark had become the reason she was alivened, bound to a man she barely understood, as the sun set again. They reached a hidden valley surrounded by cliffs. Smoke rose from within homes, built of mud and stone, children playing near the river, women weaving by the firelight. This was his camp, his kingdom carved out of the wilderness. The people stopped what they were doing when they saw him arrive with her. Their faces were cautious, some curious, others cold. A tall warrior stepped forward, his hair braided in eagle feathers. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone sharp. The king listened in silence before answering, his voice steady but firm. The exchange ended with the other man bowing his head reluctantly. The woman understood none of the words, but she felt the tension like a current in the air. The man who challenged the king was clearly respected, maybe a brother or commander, and he didn't like what was happening. When the king turned back to her, his expression had hardened again. He pointed toward a small hut near the stream. "You will stay there," he said. "The women will bring you food. Do not wander beyond the fires until I call you." She wanted to ask why, but his tone left no room for questions. The women guided her to the hut and handed her a folded blanket. Inside, the air smelled of earth and herbs. She sank to the ground, staring at the flickering light that seeped through the cracks. Her heart thudded with fear, yet beneath it, a strange calm began to settle. For the first time in days, she wasn't bound. No chains, no rough hands dragging her. Only the weight of confusion and the whisper of something unknown pulling her deeper into this world. Outside, the Apache king stood by the fire with his council. They spoke in low tones about her, their words filled with doubt. "She carries the mark," one of them said, "but she is not of our kind." Another replied, "Perhaps it is a trick. The settlers use strange signs now. You cannot trust what you see." The king listened, but did not waver. "The spirits showed her to me," he said. "The same mark my grandmother bore. The same fire in her eyes. This is not chance." His voice dropped lower, almost like a prayer. "She belongs here, though she does not know it yet." That night, the woman dreamed of fire and sandstorms. In her dream, she saw a group of Apache riders fleeing across the desert, chased by soldiers with rifles. Among them was a young woman with the same tattoo, carrying a baby close to her chest. Arrows flew, smoke filled the air, and the woman fell. Before dying, she pressed her hand to the child's shoulder, leaving behind the mark. When the captive awoke, her body was trembling. She didn't know if it was just a dream or a memory passed down through blood. Days turned into weeks. Life in the Apache camp followed a rhythm she slowly began to understand. The people rose with the sun, hunted by day, sang to the fire at night. She watched how they lived, how they honored the land and spoke to it like a living thing. Some of the women began to speak to her in broken English, teaching her small words in their language. They called her lost blood. She didn't know what that meant, but it stayed with her. The king visited her often, not always speaking. Sometimes he would bring her water from the spring or herbs for her wounds. Once he handed her a carved wooden figure shaped like a hawk and said, "For protection." She thanked him quietly. Though his presence made her uneasy, she also felt a strange safety near him, as if the desert itself was watching over her through his eyes. But beneath the calm of the valley, tension was growing. The other warrior, the one who had challenged the king, watched her with suspicion. She overheard whispers that the tribe feared her mark would bring misfortune. One night, when the moon hung low, she saw shadows moving near her hut. Someone whispered in Apache, followed by footsteps fading into the dark. The next morning, the carved hawk was missing. The king knew something had changed. He called the council again, his tone harder this time. "There are those who doubt the will of the spirits," he said, "but I will not let fear break what has been given. The mark returned for a reason. The blood of our ancestors has come back." His eyes moved to the woman standing quietly at the edge of the firelight. "Until the moon completes its next circle, she will remain under my protection. After that, the spirits will decide her fate." The camp grew uneasy. Some bowed their heads in silence. Others muttered among themselves. The woman stood still, her heart pounding. She didn't know what this judgment meant. Only that the man who claimed her as his wife now faced rebellion among his own people. The tension hung heavy like storm clouds waiting to break. As the fire dimmed and the wind rose through the canyon, she glanced at him once more. The flickering light caught the scar along his chest, the glint of determination in his eyes. For a brief second, she thought she saw something softer, their pain, maybe, or longing, but then it vanished. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains. The air smelled of rain, rare and wild, and as she stood beneath that restless sky, she knew that whatever tied her to this man in this land had only begun to reveal itself. The desert was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The first drops of rain never reached the ground. They hung in the air like silver threads, then vanished into dust before touching the valley floor. The people stared up, hands open, hoping the sky would break. It did not. The woman felt that false promise in her chest. In the week since the king's declaration, the tribe had lived inside a storm that had not yet arrived. The drought crept back. The river grew thin. Whispers rose with the wind. Some said the mark on her shoulder had returned a blessing long lost. Others said it had woken a debt the land still meant to collect. She kept to the edge of the firelight, helping where she could, grinding corn beside the older women, learning to stitch leather, folding blankets at dusk. Still, every movement carried a watcher's gaze. The warrior who opposed the king rode the ridge each morning, scanning the horizon for riders from the fort. The traders who had taken her had not all fallen in the canyon. 2 had crawled away into the juniper. Word would travel. Soldiers might come. The warrior's eyes were sharp when they crossed hers, a warning she felt more than understood. He strode into council with the confidence of a man whose pride had been stung. He wanted to move the camp deeper into the mountains and send her to a sister clan until the danger passed. He did not shape the words like an open threat, but the air around him carried the weight of one. The healer visited her at dawn with a bundle of sage and a bowl of water tinted with crushed roots. The old woman traced the tattoo with a fingertip and asked questions in slow, patient English. Did her mother sing in a language she did not know? Did she hide her left shoulder when strangers were near? The woman tried to answer, struggling to pull sense from a childhood stitched with half-truths. Her mother had warned her never to speak of the mark. Once, while washing at a river, she had been told by a passing wagon driver that the symbol belonged to a ghost tribe. She had laughed then, pretending courage. The healer did not laugh. She held the bowl to the woman's lips and said the desert has a long memory, and blood has the longest memory of all. On the 7th night of the moon, the carved hawk returned. A child left it at the door of the hut, wrapped in a scrap of deerskin. The beak was chipped now, as if it had been dropped from a height. The woman turned it over in her hands, feeling the grooves the king's knife had left. The gift felt like a promise and a warning both. When she stepped outside, she found the king waiting near the stream. He said nothing at first, letting the water speak. Then he told her what the Ridge Riders had seen. Smoke to the north. A scout at dusk who wore a blue coat and rode alone, keeping low in the saddles of gullies. The fort near the far crossing had a new officer. The man had been asking questions about a missing wagon and a woman with a strange brand. The king watched the river grow narrow as he spoke. He admitted the council was divided. Some would take her to the sister clan at once. Some would trade her to the fort for safe passage and winter supplies. His voice did not change when he said this, but something inside the woman tightened. He then told her something he had not shared with the others. When he was a boy, his grandmother had taken him to the places where her people once camped. At each site, she hummed a melody and touched a rock with a symbol many had forgotten. The same symbol slept on the woman's skin. He believed those marks gave the land a way to recognize its own. He had not told the council, because faith can sound like madness when water runs short. He needed proof, something more than a memory and a dream. The woman asked, in a voice smaller than she intended, what proof the land might give. The king studied the sky. He said there was a canyon west of the valley where a spring used to rise after the first summer storms. The spring had died in recent years. If the earth remembered the old blood, perhaps it would open to a voice it once trusted. He was not asking her to conjure rain. He was asking her to stand with him at a place where his people prayed for water and to let the land decide whether the mark mattered. She thought of the carved hawk. She thought of the dream of the young mother pressing a hand to a child's shoulder. She nodded because refusing felt like turning away from her own heartbeat. They rode before dawn. Only the king, the woman, and the healer, who said the earth listens more closely when pride stays home. The canyon rose in red walls that caught the first light. At its throat lay an overhang painted with ochre hands and spirals. The healer spread sage and coals. The king spoke in his language, low and steady. The woman stood with the wind, catching her hair, and tried to feel whatever the king wanted her to feel. She remembered the lullabies her mother used to hum and found a fragment of one in her chest. The notes were soft and simple, a rise and fall like breathing. She did not know the words, only the shape of the sound. The canyon held its breath. Somewhere a rock fell. Far above, a hawk turned slow circles. The woman felt heat roll across her skin, then a chill. The ground did not open. The sky did not break. But as they stood there, a thin silver thread began to slip from the rock face, where a crack ran dark with old minerals. It was not a spring, not yet, only a whisper of water drawing a crooked line into the dust. The healer smiled at nothing. The king bowed his head so no one would see his mouth tremble. When they returned, the ridge riders met them with hard news. The scouts from the fort had moved closer. A smoke signal had risen from the mesa and answered another near the railroad line. The warrior who opposed the king said this was the moment to send her away and scatter the camp. He had already prepared a small party to lead her south. He spoke like a man saving his people from a fire he could smell, but no one else could see. The king refused. The valley had shown a sign. He would not abandon it, or the woman who wore the sign on her skin. The warrior's jaw clenched. He said the tribe had lived through worse than doubt. He reminded the council how many times the fort had broken promises. How often a new officer meant a new plan to push them deeper into the rocks until there was nowhere left to go. He had men who would follow him if the king led them into the mountains. He had men who would follow him even if the king did not. That night, the woman could not sleep. She walked to the edge of the camp and found the boy who had returned the carved hawk. He sat alone, rolling a small stone between his palms. His mother had died the winter before, he told her in halting English, and his uncle was the warrior who defied the king. He liked the king's quiet and his way of listening to the river. But he also loved the uncle who taught him to track deer and read stars. The boy asked if the mark hurt. She told him it did not, except when people looked at it as if it might bring thunder. He whispered that sometimes thunder is the only thing that makes the ground remember where it hid the water. The boy's words settled into her like echoes. At dawn, 3 riders appeared on the plain. One carried a white cloth on a stick. The others wore no coats, only shirts the color of dust. But their saddles were army saddles. They stopped outside bow range and waited. The king rode out to meet them with 2 elders at his side. The woman watched from the shade of a cottonwood as the men spoke. She could not hear the words, but she knew the shape of bargaining. The rider with the white cloth gestured toward the river, and the thin cornfield then lifted his hands as if offering mercy. The king did not nod. The man pointed toward the huts and made a square in the air with his fingers to show a wooden fence. The woman felt her stomach turn. The man wanted them moved to a reservation near the tracks, close enough to watch wagons, but far enough to be forgotten. The king's horse stepped forward. His hands splayed open, showing he carried no rifle. He said something that made the rider glance toward the cottonwood as if a shadow there had spoken. Later, the elders told her what had passed between them. The fort knew about the wagon, the traders, and the raid. They also knew a woman had been taken who might belong to the tribe. The new officer wanted to avoid a skirmish that would anger distant newspapers. He would forget the wagon if the tribe moved to the new ground before winter, and if the woman was brought to the fort to be examined by a missionary who kept records. The word examined made the elders taste iron. The king answered that the land had already judged the woman. The rider's face closed like a shutter. He said soldiers would return with papers and a rope to measure the new boundary. He told the king to think of the children. Then he rode away without looking back. The council split like a cracked branch. Some argued that papers were better than bullets, that a winter under watch would save grain and lives. Others said a rope did not measure land. It only measured a lie. The warrior said the fort would come no matter what, and the woman's presence sharpened their hunger. He proposed a different bargain. Return her to the fort under a truce. Demand horses, rifles, and salt in exchange. Move the camp at once to the high pastures and let the fort count trees instead of fires. The proposal hung in the smoke while the elders studied the ground as if the dirt might offer words. The healer asked to speak. She told the council what she had seen at the canyon. She spoke in that quiet voice that sounds weak until it refuses to break. The warrior rolled his shoulders, more weary than angry now, and said springs can trick the eye when a night is damp. The king said he would go again and bring anyone who doubted to watch the rock open. The warrior lifted a hand. He did not need proof of a drop of water. He needed proof that the woman's mark would save them from iron and paper. The king said there is no proof for a future, only a path. That evening, the woman helped grind corn beside the fire while the healer hummed a tune to keep hands steady. A young mother asked the woman to hold her baby while she tied a basket. The child stared at the tattoo with perfect calm and patted it like a familiar trail sign. The woman's throat tightened until she could barely breathe. She realized the camp had begun to test her in small ways, to see whether her presence lightened burdens or added to them. She was not sure she had passed. She was not sure the measure belonged to her at all at the edge of the fields. The boy waited with a message. His uncle planned to leave before dawn with a small band, horses packed and bows wrapped against dew. If the king would not send the woman away, the uncle might take her by force and claim he saved the tribe. The boy did not want this. He begged the woman to speak to the king at once. She ran to the stream where the king carved a new totem from a branch of cottonwood. He listened without moving. When she finished, he set the knife down. His eyes were not surprised. He said he had been waiting for this choice since the moment he touched her shoulder. Then he did something she did not expect. He told her she would decide. He would not let the warrior steal her. He would not give her away like a horse. But if she asked to go to the sister clan for a season, he would take her himself before dawn and meet the council on the ridge with honesty instead of blood. If she chose to stay, he would face his rival in daylight, with every risk that brought. He added one last truth. If soldiers found her with the sister clan, they would still drag her to the fort. If she stayed, the fort might come faster, but the tribe would stand together. If she left, the tribe might break, and a broken tribe cannot protect anything. The woman stared at the cottonwood carving. The hawk was taking shape again, wings tucked as if to dive. She thought of the thin thread of water in the canyon, of the boy's small hands, of the mother who had pressed a mark into a child long ago and trusted the desert to carry that story forward. She thought of the riders with white cloth who drew fences in air and called it mercy. She bit the inside of her cheek until the taste of metal cleared her head. Then she lifted her eyes to the king and said she would not run from a life that kept calling her name. The words shook, but they held. The king nodded once, as if a weight he had carried alone now rested on two shoulders. He said they would gather the council at first light, with the whole camp listening. No more whispers at doorways. No more blades in the dark. He would give the warrior a chance to stand beside him. If the man refused, the king would meet him where the valley widens and the ground is level. The woman felt her breath catch. She wanted to stop him from saying the last part. But the words were already in the air. The boy stepped out from behind the cottonwood, having heard more than he should. He asked if there would be blood. The king answered that he would do everything he could to keep the tribe whole. Sometimes that means stepping into a circle with a man you once called brother. Sometimes that means trusting a mark and a memory more than the fear that keeps you alive. He looked to the woman, and for the first time she saw fear inside the certainty. Fear not for himself, but for the people who had put their sleep into his hands every night since his father died. Before dawn, a coyote called from the ridge. The valley stirred. Fires were coaxed back to life. Women filled pots at the thin river. Men checked bowstrings and saddles with careful fingers. The healer walked to the canyon path alone, humming a tune that might belong to another century. The warrior and his followers gathered near the council fire, faces hard in the gray light. The king stepped into the clearing with the woman at his side, the carved hawk tucked at his belt. The tribe formed a wide circle. In the distance, beyond the far mesa, a thin column of smoke rose and hung in the air, as still as a held breath. The boy gripped the woman's hand until both their knuckles burned. No one spoke. The wind shifted. A single raindrop touched the dust and vanished. The king raised his palm to begin, and the circle drew tight, waiting for the first word that would decide which way the ground would tilt. The wind that swept through the valley that morning carried no warmth. The air had turned sharp and dry, slicing across faces and stirring dust into the circle where the tribe had gathered. The woman stood beside the Apache king, her hands trembling, though she tried to hide it by keeping them clasped tightly together. Every eye in the camp was fixed on the space between the king and the warrior who had once called him brother. The circle around them seemed to breathe, alive with fear, anger, and something heavier than either doubt. The warrior's men stood behind him, their horses restless, their faces painted with streaks of ash and clay. They weren't enemies yet, but they were no longer allies either. Between the two sides, the healer stood motionless, her long gray hair moving with the wind. The boy crouched near the woman's hut, clutching a small wooden hawk to his chest. The king looked calm, but his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of years of restraint. "You know why we are here?" he said, his tone deep and steady. The soldiers moved closer. "The fort sends men with white flags and black hearts, and among us, the old fear rises again. You believe this woman has brought trouble. You say her mark draws death, but the land itself has spoken. The spring awoke at her touch." The warrior took a step forward, his hand resting near the handle of his knife. "The land wakes for storms too," he said sharply. "You saw one thread of water and called it a promise. I see smoke on the horizon. I see scouts counting our horses. You brought her here. And since then, the river shrinks, the corn withers, and our children whisper of soldiers. You say she belongs to your blood? Then she should follow you into exile when the valley burns." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The king's men shifted uneasily, hands on spears. The woman's heart pounded as she listened, not understanding all the words, but knowing their meaning. She felt like a shadow cast between two worlds, blamed by both, claimed by neither. She wanted to speak, to tell them she had never asked for this, that she only wanted peace, but her throat refused to form the words. The healer raised her hand, silencing the crowd. "The desert tests those who call it home," she said. "It takes before it gives, but it never lies. You all saw the spring," warrior's eyes flashed. "I saw a trick of light. I saw a stranger with a mark we once feared. You talk of spirits, but I have seen soldiers. I have buried men who trusted visions more than arrows." His gaze turned toward the woman, piercing and hard. "Tell me, do you even know the meaning of what you wear on your skin?" She froze, the question slicing through her. The truth was simple, she didn't. Her mother had never told her. But before she could answer, the king stepped in front of her. "She doesn't need to know," he said, his tone low but fierce. "The mark chose her before she was born. The blood remembers even when the mind forgets." The warrior laughed bitterly. "And you would risk all our lives for blood you cannot prove? You speak like a priest, not a leader." He turned to the gathered people, his voice rising. "I say we leave before the soldiers come. I say we send her away before the land turns against us all." The tension grew thick enough to choke on. The tribe began to split, some nodding in agreement, others standing firm behind their chief. The woman could see fear in every face. The children clung to their mothers. The horses snorted and stamped the ground. She felt like everything would break with one wrong breath. Then, from beyond the ridge, came the faint sound of hooves. Not Apache horses, heavier, slower. The warriors turned toward the sound, gripping their weapons. Dust rose in the distance and the sun caught the glint of metal. The soldiers were closer than anyone had thought. The king's expression hardened. "You brought them here," he said to the warrior. "Your messengers rode to the fort." The warrior didn't deny it. "I did what you were too proud to do," he said coldly. "I gave them a choice before they gave us bullets. They will come to take her, not us. Give her up, and they will leave." The woman's knees weakened. So this was his plan all along, to trade her for safety. The crowd erupted in shouts, some in anger, others in panic. The king raised his hand, but his voice was drowned in the noise. He looked toward the woman, his eyes locking on hers. "Go to your hut," he told her softly. "Do not come out until I say." She shook her head, fear swelling in her chest. "They'll kill you," she whispered. His hand brushed her arm just for a second, enough to steady her. "Not if the spirits still walk with us?" The warrior saw the gesture and spat on the ground. "You would die for her? For a woman you barely know?" The king turned toward him, his voice calm but dangerous. "No, I would die for the truth." The thunder of hooves grew louder. The soldiers came into view, half a dozen riders, led by a tall man with a pale beard and a rifle across his lap. The warrior stepped forward, waving a piece of white cloth. The king didn't move. The soldiers halted just outside the camp, scanning the crowd with cold, assessing eyes. The bearded officer dismounted and walked forward. "We're not here for trouble," he said. "We just want the woman. She's a runaway from a settler family. She's been causing harm in these parts. You hand her over and we'll go." The king's eyes narrowed. "You lie." The officer smirked slightly. "Maybe, but lying's easier than burying men. You've got children here. Think about them." Behind him, one of the soldiers raised a small leather satchel and poured something into his hand. The woman's breath caught it. It was the same kind of coin pouch the traders had carried when they first captured her. Proof enough of their deceit. The king's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The officer's smile faded. The air between them pulsed with threat. The warrior moved, signaling his men subtly. In a moment, tribe would turn against itself before the soldiers even fired a shot. The woman stepped forward then. Despite the king's order, "Stop," she said, her voice breaking, but loud enough to be heard. "They don't want peace. They want to take everything from you." Her eyes went to the officer. "You burned my home. You killed the people who live there." The officer's expression hardened. "You shouldn't have run, girl." The warrior turned on her, fury in his eyes. "You bring their wrath with your words," he shouted. "You curse us all." The king moved between them, drawing his knife. "If any man touches her," he said, "he will answer to me." The soldier raised his rifle then, his voice cutting through the noise. "Enough talk. Bring her here, or we'll take her."
Ow.
The king lifted his chin. "You'll have to cross the fire to do it." The officer's hand tightened on the rifle. The warrior's men raised their bows. The king's soldiers mirrored them. The valley stood on the edge of war, every heartbeat matching the distant rumble of thunder that was rolling in from the mountains. The boy began to cry quietly, clutching the wooden hawk. The healer moved toward him, whispering words of protection under her breath. Lightning flashed over the ridge. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder. Then the first shot rang out. No one knew who fired it. The sound cracked the air apart. Horses screamed, men shouted, arrows flew. The soldiers ducked for cover behind their mounts. The warrior lunged forward, swinging his knife at the king, who caught the blow with his forearm and shoved him back. The woman stumbled toward the stream, trying to reach the boy. But a bullet struck the dirt at her feet, throwing sand into her eyes. The king turned toward her, shouting her name, but his voice was swallowed by chaos. He fought his way through the circle. every strike deliberate, every motion carved from desperation. The warrior slashed again, shouting that the spirits had turned. The king ducked, caught his rival's wrist, and wrenched the knife from his hand. The soldiers began advancing, firing toward the fires that marked the camp's center. The healer stood in their path, lifting both arms, chanting words that no one could hear above the noise. The wind howled through the canyon, lifting sparks into the air like stars breaking loose. The woman crawled through the dust toward the boy, her lungs burning. When she reached him, she pulled him close, shielding him from the storm of bullets and arrows. Her eyes searched for the king through the smoke. She saw him standing in the center of the chaos, blade flashing, hair whipping in the wind. Lightning split the sky again. This time, rain fell. It came in sheets, pounding the earth, hissing against fire and metal. The soldiers faltered, blinded by the downpour. The king looked up, the rain running down his face like tears. The warrior lunged one last time, and the two men locked together, struggling in the mud. The woman screamed, but her voice was lost to the thunder. The boy clung to her arm, small voice whispering the same word again, and again the word for life in Apache. The river swelled suddenly, water rushing where there had been only dust. The ground beneath them trembled, as if something ancient had awakened. The healer's chant grew louder, almost fierce. The soldiers began to retreat, shouting to one another, dragging the wounded back to their horses. Through the rain, the woman saw the king and the warrior fall together into the mud. The wooden hawk slipped from the boy's hands and floated into the water. Spinning slowly, the storm raged on, blinding, relentless. Somewhere in the noise, she thought she heard the king's voice, calling her name. But when she turned toward the sound, all she saw was darkness and rain swallowing the firelight, leaving only the shape of the mountains against the burning sky. When the storm finally broke, the valley looked like a world reborn and wounded at once. The fires had died under the rain, leaving only smoke curling from the wet ashes. The air was heavy with the smell of mud, blood, and cedar. The horses stood trembling, their hides slick and dark. Broken arrows lay scattered near the stream. And the river that had once been a trickle now roared with new life, spilling over its banks as if the desert itself had exhaled after a long silence. The woman sat on the wet ground with the boy still in her arms. His small fingers clung to her sleeve, his face streaked with mud and tears. The wooden hawk had been carried away by the rushing water, and she watched it disappear into the current until it was gone. Around them, the survivors began to move, some helping the wounded, others standing in stunned quiet, unable to believe what had just happened. The soldiers had vanished into the distance, leaving their dead behind, and the tribe stood between ruin and miracle. When she tried to stand, pain ran through her legs, but she forced herself to move. She searched the valley with desperate eyes until she saw two figures lying near the fallen totems where the fire had burned the brightest. The rain had already washed away the blood from the ground, but the stillness around them said what words could not. She stumbled forward, calling out, her voice cracking. The healer reached her first and tried to steady her, but the woman pushed on until she knelt beside them. The warrior lay on his back, his hand open to the sky, the knife that had divided them buried in the mud beside him. His eyes were half open, but they no longer saw. The Apache king lay beside him, chest rising faintly, his breath shallow but alive. Relief hit her like a wave, and she pressed her trembling hands to his face. His skin was cold, his braids tangled with dirt and rain. He opened his eyes slowly and for a long moment, simply looked at her as if trying to be sure she was real. "You're alive," she whispered. He smiled faintly. So is the river. She felt tears she hadn't known she still had. "You saved them," she said. But he shook his head. "The land did," he murmured. It remembered the mark. The healer knelt beside them, her old eyes shining. "The bloodline has been repaid," she said. "The spring has awakened. The spirits have not turned their backs." She pressed a hand against the king's wound, whispering a prayer in Apache. The woman took his hand, refusing to let go, even when the healer warned that he needed rest. The storm had left everything changed, yet somehow, she felt the valley breathing again. Days passed slowly as the tribe rebuilt what had been torn apart. The dead were buried on the ridge, their graves marked by smooth stones and carved symbols of the hawk and the river. The warriors' followers did not flee. They stayed, bowed by grief and shame, helping the others raise new shelters and mend the fences the rain had broken. The woman worked beside them, learning their ways, her hands raw from labor but her heart steady. The boy followed her everywhere, carrying a small wooden carving. The healer had given him a new hawk, shaped from the branch of the same tree that had sheltered the king. When the king was strong enough to stand, he called the people together under the shade of the cottonwood tree. His arm was bound, but his voice carried clear and calm through the air. "We have seen what fear does," he said. "It divides what should stand as one. The land does not belong to the loudest or the strongest. It belongs to those who honor it." He turned his gaze toward the woman. The spirit showed mercy through her, though she came from another world. "She carries the blood of our ancestors, but she also carries the hope of the ones yet to come." The crowd was silent, listening. The healer stepped forward and lifted her hand toward the woman. "The river speaks her name now," she said. "It called her home." The king looked at her with a quiet softness. "You are free to go," he said. "No one will stop you if you choose to leave. The soldiers will not return. The valley is safe again." She looked around at the faces of the people who had once feared her, now watching her with trust instead. The mountains beyond the camp still glowed red under the sun, the same color as the day she was brought here. She could have gone back to the towns, to the life she once knew. But that life was dust now. Her old world had burned away. She took a slow breath and met the king's eyes. "I'm already where I belong," she said. He didn't speak, but the faintest smile curved at the corner of his mouth, the kind that carried more weight than words. The following days were filled with quiet peace. The river widened and flowed stronger, and the people began planting again. The valley that had been dying now carried the sound of children laughing, of drums echoing through twilight, of a tribe rediscovering its heart. The woman helped rebuild the huts that the fire had taken. She learned to weave, to cook over the open flame, and to speak in their tongue more fluently each day. The mark on her shoulder no longer felt like a burden. It was a bridge between two worlds, the memory of the people who came before and the promise of the ones who would live after. At night, when the stars spread over the desert like 1,000 lanterns, she would sit by the river with the boy and tell him stories about the world beyond the mountains, the oceans she had never seen, the snow that never touched this land, the music of bells from faraway churches. He would listen with wide eyes, sometimes asking if the spirits there were the same as theirs. She would smile and say, "The spirits speak in many voices, but they listen to the same hearts." One evening, as the firelight danced against the rocks, the king sat beside her, his shoulders still bound, but his strength returned. The sound of drums carried softly through the valley, the rhythm slow and steady like breathing. He looked toward the glowing horizon and said, "When the rain came, I thought the spirits were angry. Now I think they were washing away what had to die before we could live again." She nodded, understanding. "The rain didn't just save the land," she said quietly. "It saved us." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "The land remembers those who love it," he said, "and so do I." They sat in silence for a long while, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. Around them, the tribe gathered for the ceremony that marked a new season, the rebirth of the valley. The people danced, not in fear or desperation, but in gratitude. The drums echoed like thunder softened by time. The healer sang a song about the old blood returning, and the boy ran past them laughing. Holding his new hawk carving high in the air, the woman looked up at the stars and felt the weight that had haunted her since the day she was captured finally lift. Her journey, which began in chains, had led her to freedom she never expected. Not freedom from a place, but freedom to belong. To live with purpose in a land that had once been a stranger. As the fire burned low, the king rose and held out his hand to her. She took it, her fingers fitting against his palm as if they had always been meant to. The tribe quieted as he spoke. "This valley stands because we stood together," he said. "The river runs because it remembers where it came from. So do we." The crowd bowed their heads in respect, then began to sing softly. The melody carried through the night like a promise, the same kind her mother once sang when she was a child. She didn't understand the words then, but now she did. They were about endurance. It's about the way love binds what the world tries to break. When the sun rose the next morning, the desert shimmered with life. The grass glowed green near the river, the air smelled of wet earth, and the hawks soared high above the cliffs. The woman stood at the edge of the water, watching the reflection of the valley ripple around her. She could almost see the faces of the ones who came before, smiling in the current behind her. The king approached quietly. He stopped beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder where the mark lay. "It will never fade," he said softly. She looked at him and smiled. "It's not meant to." They stood together as the river moved below them, carrying the memory of all that had been lost and all that had been found. The land, once silent, now sang again through the water, through the wind, through every heartbeat that still echoed in that valley, and somewhere far down the river, the old wooden hawk drifted gently between rocks and reeds, circling in the sunlight before vanishing into the endless horizon, just as the story of the woman and the Apache king became one with the desert itself, carried forever by the breath of the land.